Hi, I'm Pratham. Today we are going to discuss about callbacks and promises and the need of callbacks and promises. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So first, what are callbacks? Callbacks are just a regular function which is passed to the another function as a parameter. So it can perform after the first function get executed to maintain the flow. So let's check some example. If I declare a function just like print, which is taking a callback and just calling that callback with a message and a callback, and I'm passing print to console.log. So it is printing I am callback here. Console.log is passed as a callback to this print function and it is just calling it. So this example does not give that much clarity that why do we need callbacks. So let's check some different example. So let's have a function is odd number, which is just taking a number as a parameter and just returning whether the number is odd or not, and same as a function is even. Okay, is even, and it is checking whether the number is even. And we have a function called filter, which helps to filter out the numbers on the basis of callback. So let's have a filtered array which stores the value after being filtered. Post num of numbers. Okay. And if callback returns true for the given number, then we just push it into the filter array and just return the filtered array. And now I'm just having a number array with 1, 2, 3, 4 and console and print it the filtered value on the basis of our two functions which I have declared here, that is odd number or is even number. So let's just call it filter with the number array and a callback for is even number. So here you can check that it is filtering on the basis of these two functions. If I don't use this callback function, then I have to declare separate methods for on the basis of both filtering. So it can be a use case of callback. Also, callbacks helps us to follow the asynchronous flow. So let's check how it can be. As you know that JavaScript is a single-threaded application language, and whenever any function takes time, it blocks the other operation and just perform that function until the function gets finally executed and then go back to the next line. So it can be a very bad experience for the user that when some highly time-taking operation is being performed and the whole UI gets hanged. so it creates a bad experience for the user. So what can we do in JavaScript? That we perform a asynchronous operation, that we pass the callbacks to the function, and that callbacks is registered to the event queue, and when the event emits, that callback function is being called and continue the flow. So let's take an example, like we have to download a file which takes up to 1 second, and we have to process it into different resolution. So like here I have a download function which just take a URL, and just I'm using a dummy implementation, that it is downloading some image or something, some file from that URL. After a second, and now my second function is processing, that tags the file and process it into different resolution, just printing it processed. So the correct flow in this that first we have to download a file, then process it into different resolution. So I have to pass callback here, that after the downloading it will just start processing that file. So I have to call it here and pass some, let us in file. If I don't do this here and call it, like this, first download and then processing, it will give me a wrong flow, which is not a correct. So for that I have to pass the callback, that after downloading we have to process that file. So now I can use it like passing a URL and the callback processing, and it will automatically called by this callback. So let's check. It is first downloading, then processing the file. Now it is a correct flow. So it is also a use case of asynchronous callback. It does not affect the JS main thread to be get blocked, and just call the callback after the 1 second. Now let's discuss some limitation of the callback, that the callback hell. So what are the callback hell? Callback hell is just a passing a callback to the function, then that function pass the another callback to the another function, that callback pass another callback to the function, and it makes harder to read for the developer. So it is called as a callback hell. So let's check an example. So here I have example, a function that is get data from databases, which is just a fake implementation. I have a data with a URL any, and just call the callback with that data, and I have a function get data from API, which is taking 1 second to get data from the API, which is also a fake implementation, and just pass the data which I got from the API to the callback, and then the another function which is responsible for saving the data to the database, which is also a fake implementation. That is, after 1 second it just print out the saving to the database with a message, and pass success to the callback. So the flow should be like, first get the URL from the database, then call the API with the given URL, with the resulted URL, and then save the data to the database. So here just I passed ID as 1, and the callback function, that is callback function to it, which is just calling the get data from API and pass the URL to this, and another callback which is responsible for saving the database, and the last callback which gets the result of success. So this function pass the URL to this, then this function pass data to this, then this function just save data to the database and pass a result, that is success, to it. And now it is hard to read for the developer, and while implementing this you can also make mistake, because it is like some messy code, but it is a correct. So this is a callback here, and we should avoid it. How can we avoid it? There are some ways. First is just mention the documentation, what does this function do, that I have right here, but this is not a correct way to write documentation. You can follow JS docs. How can we write documentation? So this documentation can help developer to know what this function is going to do. And the second way to prevent from this is promises. So let's understand what are the promises. Promises are, as name suggests, that which will have a true state, that is either the promise get fulfilled or the promise get rejected. So it is same as the simple promise, that we have promised that after the execution of the first function we call this function which you have passed as a callback to me, and I have promised that I will call that function, and the result will be true, that either fulfilled or rejected. So let's check an example of the promises. Let's have a function promise function which just return me a promise object which has a constructor which take callback. First is resolve and second is reject. If true, let's assume that we got some error here from our services like API call. So if that is going to be true, then we have to say that our promise will get rejected. So we call the reject with API error, like some messages, the reason, and if not, then we just resolve our promise, that success. And now if I just print promise function, then I get a promise of any, and now I can pass the asynchronous operation which is going to be performed when the promise get fulfilled. So I have to pass that operations function to the here as a callback, and here after the promise get fulfilled, we receive the success message that we are going to be have here, and now I am just printing it, that data here. And if my promise get rejected, which is the case in this because it is true, so we have to pass the callback what if it's get rejected, and here I get the reason, and which is just here I'm printing it. And I'm just okay. So if I check this, it is giving me API error because it is true and my promise gets rejected. So if I make it false, then it will print success. This is how promise work, that we have to pass callback what is being performed after the promise get fulfilled, and the rejected callback which is going to perform when our promise gets rejected by any reason. So we have to write it in a catch to handle that rejection, otherwise it will throw an error and crash your application. So how can this gonna resolve the callback hell issue, that now these functions which is defined here is going to return a promise instead of calling this callback directly, and same this. So after this we can write this function like then and after then I receive the data, that is URL, which now I can call the get data from API and pass the URL to it, and after that I can get the data from the URL, that the message, and now saving that message to the database. After that I will get a success message that the data is being saved in the database, and just a catch if somehow my promise get rejected. For handling this, let's we get a error message and just we console.log out the error. that we have got. Now you can see that it is now not look like a messy code, and it is now clear to read and makes it easy for your teammates to read and understand what this line of code is going to perform. So promises help us to prevent from the callbacks helps and write the code in a simpler way which can be understood by other developers. So I hope you will be able to understand what are promises and how promises work and how the data is passed to the next callback. And after the promise being settled, we got the exact data, and now we can either settle the previous promise and the complete promise, or perform any other async operation like we are doing here, that we are after getting URL we are just performing another async operation to get the data from the to save the data to the database. So that's it from my side in promise and callbacks, and in the next video we are going to learn how can we convert these things in the promises and write it in this way so it can run easily, and how to convert callbacks into promises, and also we are going to check how async and await keyword works in JavaScript, and how can it make it more clear than this. And also we will talk about promises, how can use async await instead of promises, and also some benefits of the promises where async await failed and does not give that much performance as compared to these promises. So if you like the content, please share the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.